let's look back, and we'll ask Kelley Coures to come and share with us. I personally had the benefit during our listening time for Left Turn 2. Jonathan and I sat down with Kelley, and we said, can you help us understand all the things you've learned and read? He's got a stack of books with him actually right now. And literally, he, for the next 90 minutes, didn't take a breath and just kept talking. And it was unbelievable. So I asked him to do it in actually 15 minutes. He said, you kidding me?
I'm a Jew.
So I said, okay, we're going to shoot for 25 to 30, okay? And we're going to eat during it. And so that's what we're looking at. Kelley, you probably have 30 minutes. And let me pull up your slides while you...
Only in Evansville would a 61-year-old white-haired Jew come and talk to a Christian audience about the Black experience. So Evansville, Indiana, just so you know, you can go on the city website. I commissioned a study that we paid for with some federal dollars about minority conditions in Evansville, and you can find it's a rather lengthy study, but one of the interesting images is a heat map of where minority populations live. There are 41 census tracts within the city limits. I'm going to go really, really fast, and I'm sorry about that, but I only have a few minutes. If you look at this red area right here, these 10 census tracts in Evansville, you will find that about 60% of the African-American population in Evansville, 93% of African-Americans in Vanderburgh County live within the city limits of Evansville. Only about 6.5% of African-American households are outside the city limits. About 60% live in these red census tracts right here, which is basically the old Baptist Town neighborhood, Lincoln, Walnut, Canal, Census Tract 14, all the way down to Glenwood, Culver. If you throw in this census tract right here, you have about 68% of African Americans in Evansville. The reason I throw that in there to start with is because these are two maps this is from the original Evansville City Plan in 1925. And one of the things in 1925 that the school corporation was trying to do was trying to find the old black high school. Evansville had two separate school systems. 1877, the state of Indiana said that cities like Evansville had to have separate school systems for black children. Black and white school children could not go to school together. So Evansville had at one time 5 black schools, 1 black high school, and it was about to fall down. So they were trying to find a new place to have a black high school, and they drew a map to show what they termed the principal Negro district in the city. And it turned out that this was the principal Negro district of the city right around the old Baptist Town neighborhood. This is 1925. So in 1949, the state of Indiana, the legislature overturned that 1877 school law and said that black children could go to school wherever they lived. It wasn't a desegregation bill, but it wasn't an integration bill. It was a desegregation bill. So the black schools started to close in Indiana. And so the school corporation did a new map. And so they drew a new map of what they termed the principal Negro districts, because there were more than one at that point, which still encompasses the near downtown High Street, which has been gone for many, many years. What we termed Jimtown was another principal district. And then Avondale, the name Avondale is now Glenwood. So this neighborhood down here. So that's 1925, 1950, and this is 2017. So patterns of settlement of African Americans in American cities as a whole. There's a whole school of thought about how and why the demographics of cities developed the way they did, and patterns of settlement. And a lot of it comes from what they call redlining. And that's exactly what I'm doing. So really, you have to go back to the very, very beginning. So everybody knows that Indiana was a free state, don't we? Kentucky was a slave state. Indiana was a free state. Well, that's completely and entirely and utterly wrong. So when the Indiana Territory was carved out of the Northwest Territory, one of the things that happened was the issue of slaves. Many, many white settlers in Indiana owned slaves. And the courts, the territorial courts, refused to remove ownership of slaves that people owned. So this handsome fella is Henry Vanderburgh, who'd been a hero of the War of 1812 and was a judge, or the Revolutionary War. Henry Vanderburgh was a resident of southern Indiana, and he owned slaves. The county's named for him. Our county is named for him. So Henry Vanderburgh, there were 2 slaves that he owned. a husband and wife, and they had escaped and ran to Vincennes, where they sued for their freedom. And the territorial judge, Turner was his name, he ruled in favor of this couple and said that as far as he was concerned, they were freedmen. So Henry Vanderburg decided he didn't like that ruling, so he sent men up to Vincennes and captured them and brought them back to Evansville. So Henry Vanderburg died in 1812. It took several years to settle his estate. So this is an advertisement from the Evansville Gazette, which was the newspaper of the day. So it says, will on Friday the 28th of February 1817 at the door of Peter Jones in Vincennes sell to the highest bidder a Negro woman and child belonging to the said estate. She was brought into the territory of Indiana and registered in the clerk's office under the act of the territory legislature. For the health and qualities of the woman, inquire of the administrators. So that was 1817. 1820, finally, because Indiana became a state in 1816, finally in 1820, slavery was outlawed. You could not buy or sell slaves in the state of Indiana after 1820. However, what you could do, one of two things. You could either have your slaves sign a 99-year indenture, the term indentured servitude. So they could sign a 99-year indenture, or you could put them on a flatboat and take them to Kentucky and sell them and get your capital. So if you ever heard the term sold down the river, that's where it came from the 1820 law in Indiana that forbade slaves. So finally in 1830, then, even the indentured servitude became against the law. So in 1851, there was a new constitution that was voted on by the state of Indiana, and the article dealing with blacks was deemed so critical and so important that it was decided in a separate plebiscite election. So they had one election for the whole Constitution and one section for Article 13, which forbade the sale of property to Negroes, which forbade giving employment to Negroes. It was terrible. But so that in that 1851 separate election, 87% of Evansville voters who were who? White males over the age of 21. 87% of Evansville voters endorsed Article 13. It was one of the highest percentages in that state vote. Evansville's south, Evansville's southern. It's the southernmost point of Indiana, the southernmost settlement point. So our sentiments were very much part of the South. So in 1852, so you always think of abolitionists as these wonderful white people who wanted to eliminate slavery and have African Americans as their neighbors. That is completely and utterly untrue. Abolitionists were against slavery. However, in the state of Indiana, abolitionists wanted colonization. The state of Indiana offered $5,000 in state money for transport and $50 per person willing to immigrate to the country of Liberia, which was established on the continent of Africa for the resettlement of slaves in the United States. So Indiana Governor Joseph Wright, who became a senator in 1860, in April 1862, he was part of the Republican coalition that wanted to end slavery, but they heavily advocated for forced immigration. They wanted forced colonization. His quote, we intend to have in Indiana a white population. We do not intend to have in our jails and penitentiaries crowded with free blacks. So finally, in 1863, the Indiana legislature finally recognized that colonization was a failure and removed it from the state budget. So if you go past the Civil War, Evansville, there was a huge immigration of African Americans out of the South. That first big wave after the Civil War, when before the Civil Rights Acts were passed, before there was any sort of Union troop enforcing Reconstruction for that brief period of time. So that first large immigration hit Evansville. The black population here increased about 500% between 1860 and 1870. And in 1865, Evansville had its one and only lynching. July 30th, 1865, there were two young African-American men, we only know one of their names, were arrested for an assault on a white woman who they apparently stole her jewelry and some money. And they were taken to the jail. There was no trial because the afternoon after they were arrested, a mob of 200 broke into the jail, which in those days was at 3rd and Main. You know where the dry cleaner is at 3rd and Main? So that's where that's where the first courthouse was. So they broke in, took him out, and hung him from a lamppost. And then the newspaper account from the Evansville Daily Courier was that the crowd dressed them in hats and put cigars in their mouths and enjoyed the afternoon. So that culture of lynching sort of subsided until the early 1870s. So there were lynchings in Mount Vernon, there were lynchings in Warwick County, there were lynchings in Rockport. The most harrowing one took place out of Rockport, Indiana, where 2 African-American men were arrested for the murder of a barber on Christmas Day, or Christmas Eve. And those two implicated another African-American man who swore up and down that he was innocent. And he worked at a hotel there, a little hotel in Rockport. The hotel owner testified to his innocence, that he had been working when this murder occurred. But he was arrested. This third black man was arrested. So there in Rockport, a mob broke into the jail and took out the 2 that had first been arrested, that had implicated the third man. During the melee and the confusion, the third, his name was, they called him Hustlin' Joe, Joe Raleigh. Joe managed to crawl out of a hole that had been broken into the jail wall and ran back to the hotel where he'd worked. And the guy at the hotel owner said, well, I can't harbor you, but let's try and get you out of town. So he telephoned the sheriff's office. This was 1900. He telephoned the sheriff's office, and the sheriff said, bring him here, we'll put him in a wagon, and we'll head to Boonville. Because he made a phone call to the Boonville sheriff. He called Evansville, and Evansville's sheriff said, no, you can't bring him here. We don't want him here. But the Boonville said, you can bring him here. So they got in a wagon and went to Boonville. When the mob found out that Hustlin' Joe had been taken to Boonville, what did the mob do? They got on the road, 300 or 400 people, and went to Boonville. And at Boonville, then they broke into Boonville jail and lynched him. So the culture of lynching, which was an effort to enforce white supremacy, hit very hard in southern Indiana. So in July 1903, the fellow that had been sheriff actually had become mayor, Charlie Covert. So in July of 1903, at the corner of 10th and Mulberry, there was a little tavern that catered to a black clientele, and a fellow named Lee Brown had gotten drunk and refused to pay his bar tab. And he got in a fight with the bartender, and the bartender pushed him out the door, and there was a scuffle on the sidewalk. And Thomas Massey, who was a police officer, was on his beat. He came up Mulberry to try and settle this dispute. And when he touched Lee Brown on the shoulder, told him he was going to be arrested, Lee Brown turned around, pulled a gun, and shot him. And so Massey staggered across the street, and there was a little gun battle back and forth. Lee Brown was wounded in the leg, and he managed to get another shot in at this police officer. So a crowd got a hold of Lee Brown. Police took him to the jail, which is the old jail you see now on 4th Street. By then, the new jail had been built. And Massey died the next morning. So when news got out that Massey had died, he was the first police officer to be killed in the line of duty in Evansville. When word got out that Massey died, about 5 o'clock in the evening, there was a crowd of about 4,000 in 4th Street, between the courthouse and the jail. And the crowd demanded Lee Brown be brought out. They were going to lynch him. So Mayor Covert, the sheriff, the chief of police, they decided that they were going to get Lee Brown out of town. So there's a tunnel, you may not know, there's a tunnel that runs from the jail under 4th Street to the courthouse. I think it's closed up now. But so they hustled around into the courthouse and out the 5th Street door, the basement door, and put him in a wagon. They took him to Vincennes, put him on a train, and took him to Vincennes. But for 6 nights, Evansville was racked with violence. White mobs, they were angry that they couldn't lynch Lee Brown. They busted into the jail. They pulled down a telephone pole. Mayor Covert called the governor, Winfield, and said, we need the National Guard came here, and the National Guard set up in front of the jail. And on the night of July the 9th, there was probably 7,000 white people in front of the National Guard. The National Guard were lined up in front of the jail, and nobody knows who fired the first shot. But at the end of the evening, after about 75 shots, 16 people were dead, including an 11-year-old girl who was killed sitting in a wagon. So it really was a terrible stain on Evansville's reputation. Our black population in 1900 was somewhere around 8,000. By 1910, it had dropped to around 6,000. A lot of people fled and never came back. The implications of all that were very long-lasting. The media in Evansville, the newspapers, the popular culture, was terribly, terribly anti-black. The stories in the newspapers that people read, Mr. and Mrs. White Evansville, would read in the morning were fights and gunfights and angry black wives chasing their husbands with rolling pins through Baptist Town, the perpetual racial stereotype. The cartoons that appeared in the Courier for decades were terribly negative towards African Americans, and that's one of the reasons that African Americans stagnated both socially and economically, not just in Evansville, but everywhere, not just the South, everywhere. Lynchings didn't happen in just the South, they happened everywhere. Duluth, Minnesota, Omaha, Nebraska, Michigan, Massachusetts, there were lynchings everywhere. So we showed the principal district there in 1925, and boy, have I skipped an awful lot of history. But so that's 1925. So a ghetto, that's actually a Jewish term, if you want to know the truth. One of the way you create a ghetto, if you can't do it by zoning and you can't do it by walls, there's a way that you can do it, and I'll show you how to do it. So there was a city election in 1905, which was a pivotal election in city history. The Courier tried to expose the importation of African Americans that were imported to vote in that election. And it was one of the reasons that there was such a crackdown on black-owned businesses and the African-American neighborhoods in Evansville was that election in 1905. Whether or not blacks were imported to vote, I don't know. The accusations were there. What we do know is that the actual tallied black vote in the 1905 election was almost exactly what it was in 1901. And it was almost exactly what it was in 1897. So there was no huge increase in the black vote. So you can't really say whether or not there was that, but that was the pivotal moment for blacks in Evansville. So in 1907, 4 years after that terrible racial conflict, there were 2 teachers that were hired. The school board decided in 1902 to take out advanced mathematics from Frederick Douglass High School. They took out Latin. They took out any foreign language. They took out advanced English courses, and they reduced the number of years that a black high school student took to graduate from 4 to 3, because the school board, the president, Howard Rusa, who a school was named after him later, which is now the Joshua Academy, Howard Rusa said that blacks needed to prepare for their life's work, which was domestic science, manual arts, lawn care, those type of things, which advanced math and English and science had no part in their lives. So they hired Moses and Beulah Davis, who'd been teachers at other highly recognized black schools in the state of Indiana, and they moved to Evansville. So Beulah and Moses Davis made an offer to buy a house at 915 Linwood Avenue. The house next door is the fancy stone house that's now at 1219. There was a renumbering, if you know where that house is in TP Park. So 915 was the empty lot next door. Well, the minute that news got out in June of 1907 that a black couple had made an offer and it was accepted on Henry Schrader's house at 915 Linwood Avenue, the whole neighborhood exploded. There were almost riots in the street on Monroe, at Monroe and Linwood, and Jefferson and Linwood. Hundreds of people were in the street demanding that the Henry Schrader rescind this deal. They went to the school board, and demanded that these teachers be fired from their jobs because they'd bought a house in this white-only neighborhood. It was terrible. They threatened to poison the cistern. They killed the family dog of the Schrader. They beat up the Schrader's boys in the street, the other kids in the neighborhood, because they'd sold their house to this black couple. So it was a horrible scandal. It was terrible. So eventually the Davises gave the money back to the Schraders, and they didn't buy the house there. But that didn't stop the problem. The people who'd spent all their money on these houses in what was called Tuxedo Park were furious with the developer. And they demanded to know why they had to build a house with 1,200 square feet, had to be connected to the city sewer, had to have a central heating system, it had to be connected to electricity, it had to have all these things. How did that not stop what they termed this Negro invasion into their neighborhood? So the developer who was developing Bedford Park, which was just east of Tuxedo Park, figured out a way to do it. And it was called a deed restriction. So outside of Tuxedo Park, further east in Bedford Park, and later in Ravenswood Park, a deed restriction was put on those properties that said, and you can read them on the deeds now, from 1913, 1914, 1915, the house I grew up in, my grandfather, my father's father couldn't have owned, because it said this property will never be conveyed to anyone other than the Caucasian race or the Christian faith. That's how you create a ghetto without a zoning ordinance. Indianapolis had tried a racial zoning ordinance, and it was approved by the Indianapolis City Council, but it was overturned by the Indiana Supreme Court. So they couldn't do that but you can do it by deed restriction. So part of the problem that African Americans had in Evansville, there was no justice for African Americans. African Americans couldn't serve on a jury unless both parties in the trial were African American. A black person couldn't serve on a jury if a black person was suing a white person, or if a white person was suing a black person. Only if both parties were black could an African American serve on the jury. So in February 1913, a fellow named Allen von Barron, who was about 25 years old, his father was president of the local Chamber of Commerce, and he owned a wood planing mill on First Avenue, which later became part of International Harvester. Young Mr. von Barron left his office one Saturday morning and came downstairs to the plant. Actually, the Von Barron wood planing company employed about 75 African Americans, which was rare for 1913. Very rare. It was very hard for an African American to find a job other than toting coal or cleaning houses. But he employed about 75 blacks in his factory. Allen von Barron walked downstairs with a pistol and started shooting black men working there. He managed to kill 3 black men working in the plant before he was overpowered and his gun was taken away. So the newspapers, for the week after this killing, what the newspapers talked about were Mr. von Barron's very fashionable friends that would come visit him in the jail and bring him the latest magazines, and his mother would bring him a freshly pressed white shirt and suit every morning to the jail as he awaited his trial. The judge that would have heard the case stepped aside because he was a very close friend. Judge Bach was a very close friend of Mr. von Barron, the dad, and so a new judge was appointed. The prosecuting attorney managed to get von Barron to negotiate a plea deal where he pled guilty to manslaughter on one charge, and the other 2 murder charges were dropped. And apparently the von Barron family settled with the 3 families for a cash settlement outside of court with the records all sealed. So the interesting thing about that is he was sentenced to 2 years at the state farm, where he served 1 and was released for good behavior. He later became a stunt pilot and a celebrity parachute jumper and lived to be about 80 years old. The same week that he received a 2-year sentence to the state farm for manslaughter, a black man received exactly the same sentence for stealing a pair of pants at Moskin's clothing store on Main Street. So back at the schools, there was, in 1918, there was a program of black students were presenting a musical program. None of the black schools had an auditorium, so they used Central High School downtown. At Central High School, the rule was black people and white people could not sit together. It was the same that it had at the theaters, the same rule that you used at theaters, they used at Central High Schools on all school programs. So this all-black school, this choral presentation, they had half the auditorium roped off. Black parents had to sit in the black. in the back of the room. White parents could sit wherever they wanted to. Well, there was a teacher from the 3rd Avenue black school who protested this and said, this is all their children. Why do they have to sit in the back? And so at about 9 o'clock in the evening, the principal at Central took the ropes down. And he said, all right, you win. We've got to get this thing underway. Well, all the white people left. And the black parents sat down in the front. So back to Mr. Howard Rusa. Howard Rusa, who was by then president of the school board, he said that the school corporation has a policy of separation of the races, which we find works better for everyone in the community of both races. And then right after that, they passed a rule. The school board said that all black teachers had to sit in a separate section at the school corporation offices where there were meetings. So 1920, the Indiana Ku Klux Klan began in Evansville. Joe Huffington was sent from Texas to establish a Klan stronghold in the north. And he picked Indiana because Indiana was about 80% of the white males were native born or of European descent in Indiana. So that's why they picked Indiana, and they picked Evansville because it was the southernmost point, and they thought they could get sympathy here. So by 1925, more than 24% of the white male population in Evansville belonged to the Klan. There were fun things like cross burnings and all kinds of things that went on. And they, were they would advertise their, can you see? I am so sorry. A big minstrel show, the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the KKK. Everybody invited. We're out for a good time. I don't think everybody was invited. Herbert Males was elected in 1925. He was elected mayor. He was a Republican. The Republican Party in Indiana was controlled by the Klan in the 1920s, if you didn't know that. And Herbert Males was openly a member of the Klan. Interestingly enough, Herbert Males was elected because of the black vote in Evansville. There was a man named Ernest Tidrington who was a black attorney. There were only 2 black attorneys here, and Tidrington controlled the black vote. So Tidrington made a deal with Herbert Males and said, if I get you elected mayor, you'll build us a new black high school, which became Lincoln. And the deal was that Males would name it after Tidrington. And Males said, absolutely, I'll do that. So Males benefited from what was called what was the old 7th Ward. We know it as the 4th Ward now. But the 7th Ward voted overwhelmingly for Herbert Males in that election. The Klan candidate for mayor was elected by the black vote. Let that sink in for just a second. Because of that deal. Tidrington was assassinated on Lincoln Avenue by a political rival in 1930. But Tidrington, that's what established him as what they called the boss of Baptistown. So this is what Green's Alley looked like in the 1920s, which was bounded by Lincoln Avenue, what became Canal Street, Walnut. People lived in shanties. They had dirt floors. There was very little in terms of sanitation in that area. But that's where the black population was concentrated there in what was called Baptistown, north of Lincoln Avenue. And in 1937, Lincoln Gardens, the second major PWA housing project, was built in Evansville. The first one was in Lockerbie Gardens in Indianapolis, and ours was second. But this is one of the reasons why we say redlining was established by law, because the housing authority, the United States Public Housing Authority, said Lincoln Gardens was for blacks. They built public housing for white families, but Lincoln Gardens was for blacks. And that's why that neighborhood grew up all around Lincoln Gardens was so heavily African American, was by law. But it was a miracle because if people left dirt floors and had wood floors and had central heat and running water and indoor plumbing. I mean, it was a miracle. So who's not been to the African American Museum? Has anybody not been to the African American Museum? Be honest. All right, you got to go because you got to see what it looked like. So World War II, boy, we're really skipping a lot. There was a black newspaper here for about 6 years called the Evansville Argus, which is fabulous. You can find it all on the Heritage, Indiana Heritage old newspapers. You can read every issue. It's phenomenal. But if you know, the Old North High School was called Mechanic Arts when it was built in 1939 with public tax dollars, which educated people, educated students on the mechanic arts, on carpentry, on tool and die, electrical, steelwork. It educated people on the manual arts. It was restricted to whites. It was restricted to whites until 1945. And during World War II, one of the ways you got good jobs in war plants was you went at night to the mechanic arts school and learned how to do tool and die. You learned how to do those kinds of jobs, and blacks were excluded from an awful lot of war work until very, very late in the war effort, even though there was a federal rule about integrating blacks in production jobs. So there we're up to 1950. We already looked at that map. So in 1953, the federal government announced it was going to build 2 more public housing projects in Evansville. They were going to build what became Fulton Square on the far north end, and they were going to build Sweetser homes on the southeast side. Sweetser homes was designed for white families, and Fulton Square was going to be for black families. Well, there were 2 women who lived on Governor Street, Miss Jessie Woodbridge and Molly Bowling, and they said, "Oh, no, you're not." And those 2 filed suit with the NAACP and sued the Federal Housing Authority. The local housing authority hired a whole lot of attorneys to fight that suit because they felt that it was best that Sweetser be for white families only because of where it was located. Well, they lost. In July 7th, 1953, a federal judge ruled that it was illegal, according to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, to segregate public housing paid for with public dollars. And that's the reason no more public housing was built in Indianapolis because of that rule. We still develop public housing here, but it was because of that national suit. One of the ladies' attorneys was Thurgood Marshall before he was a Supreme Court justice. So there's trivia for you today. So remember we talked about Moses Davis, their inability to buy a house in a white neighborhood. If you fast forward to 1963, you will see that this gentleman, George Chester, and his wife wanted to buy a house at 516 Kelsey in the east side of Evansville, which was an all-white neighborhood. 1963, that house, the owner had died, and the children had listed the house for sale through the Citizens Bank's trust department. And the real estate agent showed the house one afternoon to Mr. and Mrs. Chester, who had cash to buy the house. The real estate agent called the trust department at Citizens Bank and said, "We have a problem." And the trust department called the heirs, who pulled the house from the market. And thank goodness everybody was alert because it made the newspaper, and it showed that nothing in Evansville had changed in 56 years in terms of housing and redlining. So there are just a lot of articles about early protests that Africa has tried to do to try and open up the job market. In August of 1968, there were 2 incidents that happened in the inner city. There was a young black man who was arrested for alleged car theft. He was driving a rather fancy car with some of his friends, and the police stopped him and arrested him. And it was his uncle's car. The car belonged to his uncle. But he sat in jail for a day and a night before they were able to contact the uncle to tell him that that's whose car it belonged to. And then there was a killing of a young man sitting on a front porch on Taylor Avenue. And it was alleged that a white man had shot this young fella. And it turned out later, after a lot of violence, that it was one of the young man's friends, another African-American fellow that had fired. They were looking at someone's gun, and it went off and it killed him. But in August of 1968, a lot of the tension and the frustration that African-Americans had in Evansville sort of lit a flashpoint during the Chicago Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which was also a terrible, violent time. So Evansville had its worst race riot since 1903. During that time, a curfew was installed. A police officer was injured in a gunfight. A couple of houses were burned. It was terrible. There were rumors. Boy, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? There were rumors of busloads of Black Panthers on their way to Evansville that Tuesday. There were rumors all around and so there were armed white people surrounding the bus station for a couple of days. They heard that buses of Black Panthers were coming here, which is kind of stupid. But anyway, from this whole thing in November of 1968, after the Fair Housing Act in April, the city council approved an open housing ordinance that filled some gaps that the Federal Fair Housing Act left open. Private sales, leasing of 4 units or less in private transactions, those things were covered under our open housing ordinance. So that actual period of unrest really did solve something. So the last thing I'll leave you with is the Evansville Courier every day from 1919 until 1956 on its comics page, and then later on its classified ad page, ran a cartoon called Hambone's Meditation, which was a stereotype cartoon of a black man imparting wisdom in a stereotypical black dialect. So if you wonder why African Americans have had a hard time in organized life, in careers, in starting businesses, in establishing social and economic equality in Evansville, you want to think back to what Evansville saw every day in its paper from 1919 to 1956. And the only reason they stopped printing it, you know why? Because the guy died that drew it. That's the only reason they stopped running that cartoon. Who knows how long it would have run. And they finally stopped using the term Negro in about 1974. So when you read the accounts and the stories, it's anyway. But that's in 30 minutes, that's what I know, and now you know. So you need to buy these books, you need to read, and there you go.